Thank you, Anthony. Good to be back here. Well, indeed, we are supposed to talk about future geopolitics, although geopolitics is all over the place these days, but it will be there in the future as well. That's the purpose of the panel. That I'll introduce the speakers shortly, although they don't need a real introduction, and the bios are on the program, I think. Robert Cooper on my left. Robert told me that he just picked one of his many functions for the bio, which is Senior Fellow of the Dahrendorf Forum.
Many meaningless functions.
Okay. But Robert is also a member of the OSCE panel of eminent persons. Has an distinguished career in the British Foreign Service and the EU, and both the Council and then the EEAS. So he's one of those Brussels institutions. So I think your name will be written into the treaty at its next revision. Then we have Alexandra Scheffer, Senior Transatlantic Fellow, working at the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund. Alexandra's specialty is transatlantic relations. And Jonathan Holslag, who's the Chinaman. But the Chinaman whose interests go well beyond China, and is not only a researcher, but also a commentator writing for different papers, and also an advisor to First President of the Commission, Franz Timmermans. So I think we are well equipped to talk about the future, which is obviously the focus of the ESPAS report, pointing to the shift of the geopolitical center from the west, or what's left of it, to the east. And also, I think that the future of the multipolar system as we know it is very much a subject of the ESPAS analysis. As it is, by the way, it's one of those issues that the High Representative is going to deal with while elaborating a new global strategy of the European Union that was already signaled in the assessment report presented in June of this year, and work is ongoing, and then the new strategy will be presented in June or by June of next year. So, but a lot of change has happened over the last two or 3 years, so it sort of prompts us to try to update our perception of the future. So maybe we'll start with a more general question to the panelists about what should be the focus of your research, your work, our collective efforts in dealing with the challenges, let's say by 2030, which is more or less the time horizon of the ESPAS report. So what are the watch points? What should be dealing with? So we'll do a quick round. If you could try to concentrate your message, and then we'll deal with some specifics in the second round, and then I open the floor for questions. I start with Robert.
In 2030, what am I going to be doing? I'm going to be drinking the Hermitage La Chapelle 2001, which will be ready just at that moment.
Sounds like a good plan.
And I'm going to be, we will be at the end of a period where many things will have gone right, and I will be waiting for the catastrophe, which is probably coming very soon.
Okay, that's still a bit general, but we'll dig into that at the second round. Okay, Alexandra.
Yes, I'll steal your mic. Old-fashioned. Yes. I would say the core of my work would probably be thinking about the future of the American leadership. I think that's a huge question. It's a question that we're actually struggling with here in Brussels and other European countries. In France, where I am based, it's a huge debate every day. And I think that in 15 years from now, because we're thinking of 2030, that will still be an extremely relevant question. I believe that US leadership will continue to be assessed through the capacity of the United States to respond to the many crises that we're facing today and that we will continue to face in 2030. So I think that the issue of US leadership in terms of crisis management is going to become increasingly important, and there probably is going to be increasing demands for more US engagement. And that's going to be an issue for the United States. Then you have, on the other side of the pond, as we say, the issue of European leadership. That's maybe an even more complicated issue, but we'll get back to that. And then I would say something that is linked to our reflection on leadership, the future of our system of alliances. It really strikes me how our alliances are being redefined. Obviously, the Transatlantic Partnership is crucially important, but not enough. And so how and to what extent the United States, but also its European allies, are going to be willing to include other powers into their partnership? How are we going to rethink crisis management in a more hybrid way? How do you include China? How do you include Russia? We see that on the Syrian issue, or other powers when it comes to responding to the many crises that we will be facing in 2030. In Africa, there is a willingness to delegate more and more of the responsibilities of peacekeeping to African regional organizations. So I think this trend is also going to become increasingly important as we move to 2030, and as Americans but also Europeans will be less willing to commit militarily to regional conflicts where they might feel they don't have direct security stakes.
Thank you. Well, after the doomsday that Robert referred to, I probably will be useless at university because there will be no money for universities anymore. So I might have become a goat farmer somewhere in the south of Belgium. Now, the main question that, of course, is important for the discussion here today is why will this instability happen, and what might be the causes of instability, and then the question addressed to me is what might be the role of Asia in that. And then there are a few issues that I think in the coming decades we have to follow very, very closely. First important trend, first important issue, that is the transformation of Eurasia as one geopolitical and geoeconomic security complex. And I think it's because of two reasons. First of all, China is emerging as a giant interconnector, just by the nature and the size of this vast country. It's linking up effectively the east to the west and rendering traditional borders more redundant, so that we no longer speak about Southeast Asia, Central Asia. I think that increasingly becomes a thing of the past. Second important question or issue is the ability of Asia to struggle through a transitional bottleneck that consists of two important tensions. First tension, I think, is the most obvious one, that is the uncertainty as a result of shift in the balance of power. Shift in the balance of power caused mostly by the fact that the other Asian powers, Eurasian powers, are not able to keep pace with China's growth. If we just compare the evolution between China and the other Asian countries, we see that China is controlling a growing part of manufacturing trade, that China now spends on its armed forces more than Japan, South Korea, India combined. And that, of course, leads to a lot of nervousness. In addition, I think, and this is equally important, we see in Asia, let's say, an important change in the way economic growth is manifesting itself. GDP-wise, nominal GDP, Asia is still doing quite well in spite of Chinese slowdown. But since a few years, since a decade, we see growth translating less and less in formal sector employment, with China expropriating a disproportional share of that employment, so that other countries lose out. And also that we see it translating less and less in increases in real disposable income. And I think this is one of the reasons why we are confronted throughout the Asian continent with more and more domestic unrest, certainly in Southeast Asia, but also in South and Central Asia. So we have a confluence of uncertainty about the balance of power, and we have then on the other hand also more political instability, then leading to the question, how will countries cope with that? States will be under duress, will be under pressure. Will that lead to fragmentation, or will it lead, certainly in the short term, to more nationalism and then as a result also military muscle flexing? So that I think is quite crucial in understanding the region. And then lastly also, well, what is going to be the end result of all this? Will China emerge as, let's say, a new quasi-imperial power, with the margins of Asia being sort of its political and economic periphery, or will China fail? And will still we see Asia as a more multipolar setting? Will India, and this is of course a very important issue as well, will India be able to catch up? Is Narendra Modi going to deliver on his promise to create enough formal sector jobs? I have my doubts about it. I don't think that India is going to be able to deliver, but these are of course all, I think, decisive elements in trying to find out where the region is going to.
Thank you. Well, Robert, before the disaster comes, we still need to deal with some immediate challenges, and one of them is sort of the state of multilateralism as we know it. I mean, you also wrote about it in your book of 2003, Breaking of Nations. In a way, it's interesting to see when we look at the developments in Europe or in the West and in Asia that we are faced with, I think that was Mark Leonard who called it the Westphalian paradox. We are moving away from the Westphalian nation state because it's not good enough, whereas the emerging or the already emerged powers, they really enjoy the nation state. I mean, particularly the Chinese, but also the Brazilians or the Indians. What implications does it have for the multilateral world order, if any?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call it the Westphalian paradox, but there's certainly a paradox. The European world came to an end with the end of the Cold War. This was a European event, and but it was also a global event. But after that, we now have, for the first time, we have great powers which are non-European. And for the first time, we have great powers which are developing countries. And the curious thing is that they have adopted that supreme European invention, the invention that made Europe great, the sovereign state. The sovereign, self-absorbed, self-centered, autistic nation state. And, but now these are countries on a different scale with this, this important social disability that they are entirely occupied with themselves. But they're now so big that they make a presence in the world. And that is at least one version of the catastrophe.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, that's also...
So and by the way, we don't understand them either. This is a world which is bigger, it's more foreign, it's got more sovereign powers, and they are, if anything, more fiercely sovereign than the sovereign powers that we're used to.
Because I'm afraid they did not copy-paste the European sovereign state. I mean, it was adapted.
They copy-pasted the worst features.
The 19th century variant, probably.
And the kind of the self-centeredness of it, the lack of connections to the outside world, the solipsism, the belief that actually nobody else really exists.
And we also try to describe them using terms that are not necessarily appropriate. I mean, you know, the term of developing country these days, the OECD are trying to put a nuance into that, saying that they're developing and middle income countries, still developing, but middle income. I'm not sure it really holds.
No, because I don't know what is a developing country now.
That's exactly the problem.
They still have good airports, and they don't usually have good armies, but there are people there who are well armed.
Indeed. Well, I'll go to Jonathan now. Still on this multilateral order, or the future of it, because the world order as we know it, I mean the post-1945, is under strain for all kinds of reasons, and the developments in Ukraine or in the south just show it again, that it is under strain, and the difficulties that we see on a daily basis in New York. Is it that, I mean, do we see an emergence of a parallel system? Because the Chinese are trying to develop, the Chinese or the BRICS, their own network of institutions, whether it's the investment bank, I mean the infrastructure investment bank, the One Belt, One Road, the BRICS Development Bank. If you add it up, I mean, it's not as coherent or as the UN or the Bretton Woods, but it is an alternative. Would you agree with that?
Yes, 2 points. First of all, I fully agree with what Mr. Cooper just said, that we are relapsing again into sort of a new sovereignism. But I think it's often sovereignism or nationalism or etatism, however you want to call it, out of weakness. It's domestic pressure instigating governments to take a harder line on their economic interest, on their territorial interest, and so forth. The main question is how long can they stick to that? You see a lot of sort of new strong nations like Japan, India, Indonesia, and so forth, but from within, from inside, they are crumbling, getting weaker, in fact, and more fragmented. Then, when it comes to your question, I think that we are increasingly witnessing two things: competitive multilateralism and competitive connectivity, as I usually call it. Now, you have indeed countries like China trying to set up a parallel circuit of multilateralism, mostly I would say to exert their economic interests. I think if we look at the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, for instance, BRICS Development Bank, and so forth, this has all to do with the fact that as a result of China's economic nationalism, factories in a country are glutted, there is overcapacity, there is this huge reservoir of excess capital, like foreign exchange reserves, build up, and they have to get rid of that, and they want to do it in a way that is as strategic as possible, and that strengthens the economy. So that's the explanation of those initiatives. I think it also leads to a situation in which they try to pursue competitive connectivity, and with that I mean essentially that, contrarily to economic sovereignism or economic nationalism, mercantilism in the 19th century, it's not so much about closing borders to trade. It's more about the art of manipulating globalization. And I think the Chinese are very skillful in that. They manipulate globalization by means of their export credit. They do it by means of indigenous development policies, by means of a very, very clever economic diplomacy. And it's extremely hard for the European Union to come to grips with that, because it falls largely outside the scope of the WTO. And I think our own way of thinking about economic interest, about trade, about industry, shows a certain disconnect with the way these countries conceive their policies.
Well, because Europe is no longer in the center of the world. Although if you open up a school book, it's still there. A map, Europe is always in the middle, probably no longer valid. But because we are being challenged from different directions, I think that only validates once again the importance of the transatlantic dimension. You mentioned that briefly in the introduction. As we talk about multilateralism and the challenges to it, transatlantic relationship is also a form of multilateralism. It also has its difficulties, although there is one positive development, or paradoxically positive development, because it was a positive development because of the war in the Ukraine, and that's what I call the NATO renaissance. I mean, NATO was sort of doing a soul searching after the end of the Cold War. Then there was Afghanistan. Afghanistan slowly coming to an end, slowly. And now the Wales summit, you know, there was a lot of optimism and a revival feeling. Would you agree with that?
So maybe just before answering that question on the discussion we've just been having, I think that, I mean, I agree with both of my colleagues. I think that probably the underlying question when we talk of multilateralism, multipolarity, how the world is going to look like in 2030, is probably to ask ourselves whether countries like China or other so-called emerging powers are going to continue to be willing to operate within the existing international order, or will they eventually want to pursue a revisionist course? And what I see is that for the moment, what we call the BRICS, but I think it's a wrong acronym because they're all very different and all looking in different directions. They don't really want to revise the international order. They're pretty much happy to play with it. Don't want to reform it, but they're in a sort of tinkering approach. They're influencing. They're trying to advance their interests, but within the international existing order. So I think their strategy is quite subtle. And I wonder to what extent in 15 years they're really going to have a more aggressive revisionist course, probably in their regional arrangements, more than maybe on the global level. So on the transatlantic partnership, it's true that we've been discussing about NATO's renaissance or a new raison d'être post-Afghanistan, that we were desperately looking for a justification of NATO's existence after Afghanistan. I think it's a pity that we had to wait for Putin to actually give us this new raison d'être. We should have probably been more attentive to the signals that Putin has been sending to us for quite a long time. What I would say in terms of thinking about the transatlantic partnership in the 15 years to come, I think we need to look at the challenges that we are going to face. And my argument here would be that we are going to be more tested on our weaknesses rather than our strengths. I think that we haven't really fully assessed what our strategic weaknesses are today. And I think that as transatlantic allies, we need to strengthen our cooperation on our common weaknesses. We are clearly being tested on our weaknesses by Russia, by China, by other powers. And what we can see is that the criteria of power these last years and in the years to come is being profoundly redefined. Military power. It seems that interstate conflict was not a reality anymore, and it seems that hard politics or geopolitics is back. But that again is a false perception. Hard politics, geopolitics has always been there, but we wanted to believe that it was actually gone, and especially in our neighborhoods. And so this is going to be a key factor. The fact also that military power is not the monopoly of the state. We've been talking of the state, non-state actors. Non-state actors also know how to more and more use, non-conventional means, the cyber threats. How are we going to deal with this new type of warfare? Because this obviously is a domain where we are being tested. It's not an Article 5 threat that Putin has waged. It is a hybrid. It is an ambiguous threat. How do we deal with that? And I think we really need to work on that with our American allies. If you look at the global military balance of power, Saudi Arabia is now ranking 4th in terms of defense spending worldwide. It has surpassed the UK and France. That's also very meaningful in terms of how the world is going to move on in terms of military spending, and it is slightly beneath Russia. So you have the US, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. And this tells a lot also about, I would say, the perceptions of the security threats in the world, and it tells also a lot about the perception of US leadership and willingness to manage the crisis. Why is Saudi Arabia has reinforced its defense budget by 17% in 2014? Because it believes that it has to defend itself and that the United States will probably not be as committed maybe to the Gulf security than it might have in the few years to come, and in big part because of the American energy independence. So these trends are to be watched very carefully, even though, the United States is still spending three times more than China on defense, and I think 7 times more than Russia. So there is still, some evolutions, but this tells a lot about the future of the military landscape. Then there is the economic power. I think we agreed that there is definitely a shift, and a definitive shift to the east and the south. How is the transatlantic partnership going to evolve in that shift? The TTIP discussions are in a bad situation. How can we regenerate interest and confidence across the Atlantic on these specific economic issues? We are still the 2 most powerful economies in the world, but how do we value that before other powers really start playing a more important role in the norm setting in the economic field? Then you have technological power. We are struggling, United States and Europeans, to keep our technological superiority. Countries like China and others are innovating in a very, very fast way. How do we keep up with that, and how do we, try to reinforce our cooperation based on a, I would say, balanced and confident relationship as well? And what happened with Safe Harbor is, a symptom of something that we still need to build and nurture with our American partners. And lastly, demographic power. I think that in Asia, it's very striking to see that the demographic trends are extremely challenging in Africa as well, whereas we are 2 continents that are aging. How do we deal with that as well? So that's why I say it's important that we identify these weaknesses upon which we are being tested by many of these different actors, so that we can anticipate, which weaknesses are going to be exploited by our rivals or adversaries, and try and work together as the EU, but also as transatlantic allies.
Thank you. Indeed, military power has been, to a certain extent, privatized, because we have a lot of non-state actors, but it's still the nation states and the international organizations who have to cope with the consequences, meaning doing crisis management. Can I then follow-up comment?
I don't worry about. I don't worry about. I'm not sure which weaknesses you were talking about, but I don't worry about those weaknesses. The weakness that I worry about is the decline of legitimacy of states in the West. That seems to me to be much more something to worry about. And the fact that nobody's even worrying about it is worrying.
But is that confined to the West, that phenomenon? If you look at political trust levels, of course, you have China towering above all the others, still managing to maintain a certain political legitimacy. If you look at its neighboring countries, India, and most of the Southeast Asian states, well, there you see central governments also losing legitimacy extremely fast, because likewise to the European Union, I believe they are no longer able to deliver what people expect: jobs, income, and stability. So I really wouldn't confine this just to Europe and the West. It's becoming a global phenomenon, and I think part of the explanation is at least that the way of growth, the characteristic of economic growth, is allowing less than in the past to governments to create these opportunities. And the fact that it is more difficult in spite of high growth rates and in spite of recovery in case of Europe and the United States, to create these jobs, to encourage companies to invest in a way that actually it creates a stronger society. So I wouldn't really limit it to the West, but to follow up on what Alexandra said about rules.
Right, but I worry about the West because it's where we live.
Yes,
and because it's us.
Yes.
And because ultimately your strength depends on legitimacy.
Yes.
And so I don't care that much what happens to the others.
No, I think you should care about the others. Of course, if we reflect upon the legitimacy crisis from a Western and certainly European perspective, the challenges are huge, and I'm the last to deny that. But I think it also creates a context in which others, including China, including the United States, will be under even more pressure to sort of try to divert economic opportunities away from us. And this is, for me, the crux of the trade policy of most of the emerging powers. This, I think, also plays a role in the industrial policy, the new industrial policy of the United States. So you have, and I completely agree with what you say, you have a European democracy under pressure. You have a lack of legitimacy, but around that you have an economic context that becomes even more violent to that, and hence I would certainly deny that this creates additional challenges.
To draw extensive conclusions, basically you use a very famous quote from a German writer, Lessing, the Hamburger Dramaturgie. I mean, the curtain goes down and all the questions remain open. Vorhang zu und alle Fragen offen. But that was the purpose of the exercise. I would only make three very brief remarks. First, we have to accept, if we haven't done it yet, that not everybody in the world wants to be like us. So we have to live with that. At the same time, it should not lead us to self-denial. We are still a community of values. I mean, there is a community of values that we need to maintain. And I mean, of course, Europe is in relative decline, but this can be managed.
Actually, I think quite a lot of them would quite like to be like us.
Well, maybe some, but not everyone.
They're coming here. It's a sign. They're not going to Russia.
No. Some may at some point. But whatever happens, I mean, with all those questions and doom and gloom scenarios, but also from time to time a glimmer of hope, one thing is clear: we need to think about it. We need this reflection process, whether it's framed as ESPAS or the global strategy. We need to think about it so that at least we can arrive at some answers to all those pertinent questions. With that brings this panel to a close. I would like to thank my panelists, Alexandra, Robert, and Jonathan. And with that, I'll hand over to Anthony with only 5 minutes delay.